What's going on, party peoples? Game Devs of Color 2020 is live, and we are here to talk about sex positivity as a design pillar. So now, as time has gone on, games have taken on more and more mature themes. There were some games back in the day that had me doing a double take. Conquer's Bad Fur Day, I'm looking at you. Now, that all being said, the question becomes, how do we meaningfully include sex, kink, and sex positivity in games? What are the design and safety considerations? How can we create experiences that are not offensive or embarrassing? Now, this panel is going to discuss and suggest games that explore that topic of sex in new ways and figure out how to subvert common design tropes. Now we're going to introduce you to the panel because we got a fantastic lineup. First up, we have Naomi Clark, who's going to be our moderator. Naomi is an indie game designer and faculty at the NYU Game Center, where she teaches classes on game design, role-playing, and player research. She's been making games for over 2 decades, contributing to nearly 3 dozen published titles. Next up, we have Sharang Biswas, who won IndieCade and IGDN awards for game design and has showcased interactive works at institutions such as the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, Pioneer Works in Brooklyn, and the Museum of Moving Image in Queens. We also have Jonaya Kemper, whose interdisciplinary works looks at games as an emancipatory tool. The originator of the term emancipatory bleed, she has spoken and led workshops internationally on her methods. We also have Clio Yun-Su Davis, who is a game designer and writer whose work largely focuses on grief, Asian and Asian American experiences, pop culture, gender, and adolescence. And lastly, we have Rachel Lee, who is a game designer and new media artist based in Brooklyn, New York. Always curious about how and why things work the way that they do. She constantly seeks exciting new ways to question boundaries and also find new ways and forms of creative expression. So wherever you're at, I want you to show some love as we bring in our panel to talk about sex positivity as a game design pillar.
All right, thank you so much. We're all really excited to be here. I'm going to go through one more time and do a slightly different spin on those introductions in a second, because I also want you guys to all know about all the games that have been made by these panelists. But first, I'm going to say a few words about myself. Why am I here? Why am I moderating this panel? So like was just said in our great introduction, I'm both an independent game designer and I also teach at the NYU Game Center. Let's get the slides up here. I can sort of show you what I'm talking about. But a couple years ago, I found myself in a kind of a funny position. I got a grant to work on a game, and I ended up making this card game called Consentacle, which is a game about humans having sex with aliens. And I've worked on a lot of games over the years, and this was my first foray into designing a game about sex. I kind of decided it was time, like, to try and take this on, because I had actually seen a lot of interesting movement in this area, like people making more interesting, nuanced, and more queer games that dealt with intimacy and sex. So I took the plunge. That project turned out pretty successful. And now I get to talk with a lot of other awesome people out there, great game developers, like everyone on this panel, about this whole topic of how do we manage this kind of game. There are totally different challenges than with other types of game that don't get so deep into the nuances and the nitty gritty of how human beings interact with each other sensually, intimately, erotically, and we wanted to go into a little bit of that today. So who all do we have here? First of all, we have a lot of contributors to this collection, Honey and Hot Wax. So first, I want to introduce Sharang Biswas again, who was one of the editors, one of the people who made this whole collection happen. Sharang, tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Honey and Hot Wax, edited by myself and Lucian Khan, is an anthology of excuse me, of analog games, mainly LARP, but some tabletop role-playing games that explore the themes of sex and sexuality in different ways. It's when we got 2 grants from the Effing Foundation for Sex Positivity to make this happen, and we tried to bring together a diverse team of game designers who would offer very different perspectives on sex sexuality. And the aim of the project was manifold, but 2 of the main things we wanted to do was increase conversations about sex and sexuality in the analog game world, and talk about how can analog games represent such topics in an interesting way, but also explore what can analog games do with sex and sexuality. Can they just discuss them? Can they also maybe use sex acts as part of the game mechanic? So I think it's a very diverse collection of games. And we have 2 of our contributors here. So I think Jonaya can say something first.
I could say a lot of things, Sharang. Yes. Would you like to know about our games?
Yeah, why don't you give a sentence? I know we'll go into this more deeply later, so maybe a sentence about your game.
Sure. So the game I contributed to Honey and Hot Wax is called Feeding Lucy. And it's a game for 2 about the relationship between Lucy Westenra and Dracula.
Awesome, thanks. And Clio?
Also mutual masturbation. So that's a thing.
Yeah. And Clio, can you tell us about yours?
Yeah, so the game that I contributed to Honey and Hot Wax is a LARP called Pass the Sugar Please. And in it, you're all playing people who are members of the super secret, super like elitist BDSM and sex club. But right now you're at a fun tea party. But you have to convey a series of messages to your sexual partner who is also at the tea party by only referring to the food and tea items in front of you. You can't say anything actually about sex at all at any time.
And then I had a game, so there are 8 games in total, but my game was called The Echo of the Unsaid, and it's about 2 bros in college. They self-identify as bros who have unresolved sexual and possibly romantic tension with each other, and it's a 2-player LARP that you play that explores what could these relationships mean, and it's all about not talking about sex while having it.
All right, awesome. So we've got 3 people who have games in this amazing and rather groundbreaking collection. And then our final panelist, who I want to bring up her work as well, is Rachel Lee, who has been working on a card game called Nothing to See Here. Can you tell us just a little bit about it, Rachel?
Yeah, so Nothing to See Here is a storytelling card game for 4 to 6 players where you use cards to get yourselves out of compromising situations. And we just graduated from the NYU incubator this summer, and we're in the process of trying to publish this game. And we're very excited about it. Yep.
Great. Thank you guys all so much for introducing your work as well. So you might have noticed something about all of these projects. They are all non-digital games, from Mard card game to the collection Honey and Hot Wax, and then Rachel's card game she's been working on with collaborators, Nothing to See Here. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this session is non-digital, but I think we're going to touch on some digital games as well. And they're really quite different problems. You know, when I think about sex in digital games, I can't help but think of BioWare, right? They really sort of put this topic on the map for big, huge AAA video games. They got in trouble with Fox News back in the day for having sex with aliens, once again, right? Sort of like, my favorite topic. But doing so in this way, I think really left a mark on the game industry of taking the dating sim model and blowing it up to an epic $60, 300 hours of gameplay scale. And ever since then, there has been this trend that's just continued to evolve, gone into mobile, of one model of romance and sex in games as to like make the right conversations choices, and maybe you'll get some sex, out. Like that'll be your reward at the end. Now, I don't want to just rag on BioWare. They've done a lot of thinking about this topic and like how do we actually try to make this sort of push the right buttons, choose A, then choose C, and then have sex. Like they've tried to make it a little bit better than that. But for me, although I've spent most of my career making digital games, there's just such a vast landscape of what we could do with games around sex, and I think a lot of the keys to those possibilities lie in non-digital games. At NYU, we like to say that video games are just the latest incarnation of games, and that they're an interesting flower on that tree. But there are so many other ways of thinking about games that the industry often overlooks. That I'm always trying to look at what non-digital game designers are doing, maybe in the hopes of that we might be able to see, all right, like what could potentially happen for digital games as well. I want to go to a game that was really inspirational to me in my process, and I know that that I think there are other big fans of this designer on this panel as well. I think this is a game called Monster Hearts, a game about sex and relationships, deeply confused, disturbed, and sometimes downright bad or abusive teenage monsters. This is a game by Avery Alder. It's a non-digital tabletop role-playing game, and it really did a lot to sort of explore the queer space of potential for games and sex. And I just wanted to throw this up here, because it was influential for me, and also because I wanted to ask Jonaya a topic that they wanted to talk about, the history of how games and sex have intersected, right? And how desire and marginalization kind of have existed within that historical framework. So what do you think?
Oh, I have I know that this is a panel, so I have to share. So I can't give my 5-hour lecture on this. What I think is really interesting is that, earlier you mentioned that, we had these big blow-ups. Games, sex, games, right? And I think that when we pull back and we really look at play itself and what play is, as well as what we do when we play, we explore ourselves, we explore the world around us, right? That's in the most innocent games ever. Games and sex is just so not new, right? How many terrible Spencer's gift stores have those dice? You know what I'm talking about? Those little roll the dice to decide what your partner does dice, right? Those exist. Those have been a part of games and intimate play. The thing is that we don't normally talk so much about how we play in these spaces and how we play intimately. They exist, sex games and games of sex, where you go to a baby shower. What do? Oh, you play games around how the bride may have gotten pregnant, right? Quote unquote, right? To be very within the mainstream, right? You go to a bridal shower, or you go to a bachelor party or whatever, and everyone plays those weird games with plastic genitalia that don't really do anything except sort of embarrass you. But they exist, and those are games. So I'm always kind of shocked when we don't put all of these through lines together and talk about games we've experienced. And sometimes we worry that the games, the more serious games we play, are much like those kind of please don't look at me, please don't call me, I don't want the stripper over here games, to say the least. But also, I believe that games and marginalization, and when I say marginalization, what do I mean? I mean those who do not fit in, this is my favorite phrase, I say it in every talk, Audre Lorde's mythical norm, right? Audre Lorde talks about this mythical idea of who's normal. And if you are not a white, straight, wealthy, educated, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual male, right? Then, who's young, then you are not considered a part of the norm, and then everyone else is kind of outside of that. So bodies that are not cisgendered, bodies that are larger, bodies that have all sorts of differences, people of color, all of these bodies deserve to be loved and deserve to have sexy experiences, but we do not see a lot of these experiences in the public. So when we think about games and how they interact with our bodies, one of the things I really want us to think about is what can we do to have these games teach us more about the bodies that we know are not shown being loved, but we know because we inhabit these bodies deserved to be loved. We can talk, if you want, we can talk about Joel now.
I think let's save it for when we actually have some pictures of it. We'll come back to just a Little Lovin, as on one of the other games we're going to talk about. But first, I want to say, so yeah, it's only maybe within the last decade that I've started to really see a bunch of interesting work in this area. And I know that Sharang, you wanted to talk about some really interesting examples from recent years that you've noticed of like designers working with sex in games. People who are not on this panel even. So let's give them some shout outs.
Yeah, because I think the point you make about BioWare is very, very good. Is when we think about sex in games, we tend to think about Dragon Age, or what's the sci-fi version of Dragon Age? Clio, what's it called again?
Mass Effect.
Mass Effect, right. I mean, I always call him Clio for this kind of thing. But yeah, we think of that, and we don't think about other intelligent ways that games have been talked about. So at the top there, you can see Hurt Me Plenty, which is a game by Robert Young, who is another game designer who teaches at NYU, and his work, a large proportion, I would even say the majority of his game design work in recent years has been touching on sexuality in very different ways, different games. So Hurt Me Plenty, for example, is a game where you're exploring impact play or spanking in the BDSM scene. And it's a very quick, short game where you play with a mouse, you can even play with a leap motion, where you are meeting with a guy who likes being spanked, and you have a spanking session with them. And you spank them at different speeds and levels and hardness by moving your mouse quickly in certain ways. And at some the bottom, the sub will give you feedback like great in symbols. There's no words in the game. And at some point, if you spank him too much, he'll say stop, slow down, and you can slow down, and you'll see him his breathing will slow, and it's very responsive. It's actually very soothing playing this game when I first played it. And if you don't stop, on the other hand, he will actually use a safe word, and then if you don't stop, the game will physically lock you out of playing for a couple. You will not be able to log in to play the game anymore. And Robert Young has written a lot about making arguments at the algorithm level at the game. So I think that's really interesting. It's a bit more complex than just choose the right conversation choices and you get a sex scene, like Naomi mentioned. This game uses the algorithm. It stops you from playing if you violate your partner's boundaries. And that's a really interesting example of a modern game that deals with sex really well. But I feel this may be biased because I'm predominantly a consumer of analog games, but I feel analog games are doing a lot of very interesting things with sexuality that video games are not yet doing, right? So I didn't realize that this photo would be for this particular portion of the game, because I just said, these are so interesting. The game Several Miles from Heaven is my own game. I don't mean to say, look, my games are so interesting. But when I made Several Miles from Heaven, I tried to make a game where you use stripping as a game mechanic, right? Where you and your play partner, who could be an intimate partner, but it doesn't have to be, are removing clothing and looking at each other's bodies. And that's part of the game mechanic. You are looking for symbols drawn on each other's body that you draw before the start of the game. And that game tries to use stripping, or the removal of clothing, as both an act of intimacy and sexiness, and simultaneously an act of vulnerability, where you are revealing vulnerable truths about yourself. And the game is about you are teenage demigods who have mad crushes on each other, right? And so I was trying to be like, can a physical game use physical acts that are often attuned to sexuality, the removal of one's clothing in front of someone else, to be a game mechanic. Another interesting game is My Girl Sparrow by Troels Pedersen. I don't know how to pronounce that name super well, but that is a tabletop role-playing game / LARP. I played it more in a tabletop way, where it's Pedersen's interest was the idea that we have a lot of vocabulary and history of talking about emotions around romance, yet when we come to the physical acts of sex and sexuality, we often stumble and we don't speak about it, and we have difficulty speaking about it. So this is a game that's set in a future where people who don't like having physical sex anymore, they only have VR sex with each other. Physical sex is considered gross, and you four, the players, are characters who are taboo. They do taboo things. They go into the woods. They have like a cabin, and they have a sexy weekend with each other, right? Like physically, and it's wild. But the interesting thing about this game is it's full of sex scenes. It's a lot of interaction scenes where you talk in different things, and then you have all these sex scenes. But the sex scenes, which have a specific mechanism of how they work, it's not just like free for all. But in the sex scenes, you very explicitly describe what you are doing. So you would say, I trace my hand down your chest and things like that. And it can get much more explicit than that, right? Or it does get more explicit than that. But the other interesting thing is this game forbids you from ever describing an interior thought. So you cannot say, my character is excited. You have to say, oh, I start breathing heavily, or something of that sort, which is interesting because it also underscores this point that sex is about communication, and you don't always know what your other person is thinking. You have clues, you have these visual clues. So this game explores the aspect of communication during sex and then talking about sex at all and describing sex act in a really, really interesting way. And so I'm saying this to highlight that the indie game sphere, be it digital or analog, is thinking about sex, sexuality, and romance in very interesting and often groundbreaking, I don't like saying that word, but it's true here, often groundbreaking ways that the mainstream games are, maybe a little afraid of or are a bit ginger about.
Yeah, that brings me to another topic. When I look at these games, all the different types of honestly groundbreaking games you're talking about, Sharang, they all strike me as having such different tones, right? Some of them are like really lighthearted or even goofy, and I think if you design games with sex in them, I think we're all kind of aware that the potential goofiness or absurdity can be like a help to your design process, or to like getting people to engage with the game, because then at least they can kind of laugh and be silly about it. But then some of these games go all the way to the other end, like being very serious, almost like reverential, or like a quasi spiritual experience, which sex maybe can be sometimes, or maybe hopefully. So I wanted to ask Clio, I know this is a topic that interested you. When you're thinking about all those different tones, how do we handle them as designers, or how do we sort of decide like what we're going to work with in order to shape the kind of experience that we want?
Yeah, it's interesting because tone in a game is both kind of a tool that the game uses to achieve whatever its overall goal is, or that we use as designers to create our games, but it's also kind of this thing that we're building towards with all the other components of the game. So it's something that really I've been trying to think a lot more about just from the get-go whenever I start designing a game, because with Pass the Sugar Please, that game on the surface is very goofy, and it is like that is something I intended from the start, because I wanted to create something that would be very approachable, because a lot of times people are interested in playing games that deal with these themes, but they're a little bit scared too, because maybe they've never played a game before that really kind of directly handles these topics. Maybe there's so many things you can project from your own life onto these games, and you don't know how you're going to feel about it in the moment. There's again the chance for awkwardness or embarrassment. So I wanted to, with Path to Sugar, create a game where embarrassment and awkwardness was kind of the point of it. Because if everybody's sitting there in the same space feeling kind of like, oh gosh, this is not like how anybody should be communicating about sex, and I had like said something incredibly goofy, then it kind of allows you to, gives you permission to breathe and just exhale a little bit in relief, because everybody's in the same boat. And I've found in general with games that do touch on sex, they tend to stick to one tone or another. So either like, oh, look, we're going to approach sex as it's like, it's really silly, it's goofy, maybe it's really crude, and that's what we're going to stick to because like maybe like it's part of the goal of what we have in mind for the result, the experience you want people to have when they play the game. Or it's like, I have no idea how else to handle this topic. Or, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, you have games that treat sex like almost like a, you know, worship, like body worship, or, you know, just worship of intimacy. And that can also be really intimidating for people, just because it feels a little bit, I think for a lot of players, a little bit more real, a little bit like there's less of a barrier between you and your character, perhaps. And for instance, in LARPs that feature sex in some way, one kind of commonly used meta technique is called Ars Amandi. And so that's where I'm going to like totally butcher my description of this, but it's where you're basically using your hands and your arms and you're touching another player or players who you're having like an intimate encounter with, kind of sensually, and that represents the sex acts that you're participating in. And that can be really intimidating at first because that is like it feels almost spiritual. It feels like an act of worship. It's very poetic in a lot of ways. I mean, you can do it really goofily where you're just like, oh, we're doing sloppy stuff and like this is what we're doing and representing it that way, but often that's not usually why designers will stick that mechanic in. But it's just there's so many different ways to approach sex, and like I do wish there were more games out there that kind of combine tones, because in real life often it's just like you don't just have one type of sex or sexual encounter in your life, right? It's not like every time I have it, we're like laughing and laughing and laughing because it's so silly and I slipped on a banana and like, oh, bodies are weird. And like, but like sometimes it is like that. And sometimes it is like, oh my God, we're having like this deep emotional connection. I feel like my spirit just like transcended out of my body and now is like out in the outer rings of Saturn or whatever. But to have like games where it allows for both those experiences, I don't know, that this territory I'm really interested in seeing covered.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. It's true that it's so much easier to stick to one tone and like try to set the expectations of the player of like, here's how we want you to approach this difficult subject. But yeah, maybe that's like the next unexplored frontier. So speaking of like different tones and games that have like very serious subject matter and that also like maybe like really affect us personally, I want to talk a little bit about this game, Just a Little Lovin', in part because I think three of you are in this photo from a few years ago. This is a live action role playing game, but to talk about, like, bring Jonaya back up here because I know you spent a lot of time, you know, thinking and writing about this game. So please explain to our audience what this game is.
This is very interesting. So I'm going to describe this game, but I'm going to do it with a caveat, because the first time you hear this game described, you may do what I did. And there's like no way to describe this game without you kind of like, if you have not been introduced to a game that has serious topics and that has historical serious topics, and you've never been introduced in like how to play upon serious topics, this game can be very jarring. So for instance, or rather not for instance, Just a Little Lovin' was written by Hanne Grasmo and Tor Edlund, who are both Norwegian, and sex educators and queer sex educators, and write really amazing sexy games and non-sexy games. And they come from a more Nordic LARP tradition. Just Little Lovin is the story of the AIDS epidemic in New York City. And it's not just that. It's a story about love and death and desire and what it's like to endure as a community and to feel power and powerlessness all at once. The first time I heard about Jal, I was kind of livid. I was so livid, I flew to Norway. I got NYU to pay for me to go to Norway so I could talk to these people and be like, "Rawr, we need to talk about what you're doing," because my father was HIV positive. I was, as like someone who is Black, someone who is queer, someone who is a femme, I've been marginalized in many ways, but I've also been deeply touched by the AIDS epidemic. I've lost many people to it. It is something I'm deeply experienced with. So I was very concerned that there are people who couldn't possibly understand, and that the way it was going to be played was going to be very disrespectful. But Jal is really not like that. And the longer it goes on, the better it's gotten. So what you're looking at right now is a photo from the first American run. This LARP has been played several times, and more than several times. I believe it's about a decade old. People have been playing this LARP for a very long time. It's considered one of the most important Nordic LARPs. And the way that it's set up is that everything is scaffolded. The sex acts that are within, right, happen, but they happen in a very specific way. There are many, many different character groups who are all kind of encapsulated and just snapshots of early 80s New York. And you play through 3 years, right? And as you play through 3 years, the first year is those disco years, that feeling of passion and lust and love and that freedom to experiment and be yourself and feel good in your body. And then the second year is when you start realizing that HIV exists and that it's killing your community. So will you be fearful? Will you give into fear? Will you not touch? Will you hide yourself? Will you push away those that you love? You engage in grief. There's communal grief in this game. There is so many different forms of love. I love this photo. I love all of these photos. One of these two pairs and like the ones that come after, there are so many issues that are explored in Jal that you would almost need a whole nother panel to talk about it. But since we're talking about how sex is portrayed and like intimacy is portrayed, I think Jal has some of the most interesting mechanics. You can go to the next. Some of the most interesting mechanics exist. If you would like to invite someone to have a sexual scene, you walk over and you hand them a pink feather. Now, you hand them this pink feather and they can say yes or no. And through the workshopping process, before this LARP even starts, you're allowed to turn it down. And you can make that a thing. You can make it not a thing. It feels very realistic, even though you're handing them what looks like a pink craft feather, right? And once you give someone that pink craft feather, what happens is you excitedly go into a corner and then you talk them out of character and you say something like, so what would you like to have happen? And this is to speak to what Clio just said about a game that has so many different tones. And like Sharang and Clio, you can also speak to this. Jal has so many different tones. In one night of play, and this goes on for days. So Jal is played successively over the course of like 4 days. And there's debriefs, which mean you talk about everything that happens And that happens throughout, back and forth. But the way that you engage with each other is always full of consent. You never know whether or not you're going to have a fun scene or a terrible scene, because you talk to each other, right? And you decide on the way the outcome goes, and then you play it out. You can cut, you can break. It gives a lot of option. And the way that this game has changed over time really speaks to the growing recognition of the bodies that are joining the international LARP scene, making space for people of color, making space for folks who are non-binary, for folks who are trans, making space for people who deserve to feel desired. And it allows us to kind of understand queer history in a way that you may not ordinarily understand it.
Thank you so much, Jonaya. I think it's such an important and interesting game in this area. So we've got about 10 minutes left together. I really want to bring Rachel Lee back up here, because she's going to talk a little bit about the process of designing a game like this. Specifically, this one, the one that she's been working on for a while now. So Rachel, tell us about designing this game.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned before, Nothing to See Here is about getting yourself out of a compromising situation, aka an orgy, with the cards given to you. And just to talk a little bit about how the game works is, as you can see from the slide, the players would be given an identity card, a location they're found in, as well as the state they're found in. So in this case, like Tori Cruz, tape on the ceiling with an orgasm blush. So the players got to explain why they're found in that position, in that location. And after that, they'll also be given like suspicious and salacious items that will either complicate their story or can be used to sabotage another player's explanation. And after all the players has done explaining, a decision will be made by the judge. And awards will be given to players based on the type of stories they told, and eventually a player would be chosen as the scapegoat who would take all the responsibilities and deal with the consequences. Next slide. Yep. And so before we went into incubator this summer, the game was originally called The Cheaters, and we only had one scenario about cheating, where the judge is the partner who got cheated on and walks into the chaotic scene, while other players are the cheaters who slept with the cheating partner, Taylor, who never shows up in the game. So even though the game has always been fun to play with, because we have the strong gameplay mechanic of improv storytelling and the overarching theme of trying to cover up a sexy secret, but we as we play tested with different groups of people, we realized that a thing that has been holding us back or making people hesitant about playing the game is the cheating scenario, because everything else in the game is about like exploring the different sexualities and preferences and toys, but it was only the narrative setting sort of has this negative connotation to it. And the original ending we had to the game was to just let the scapegoat to say I'm sorry and apologize to the judge. And it feels like the game becomes more of trying to educate players that cheating is bad, and it sort of loses all the positive energy and humor that we had, and it also like loses the point of like celebrating sex and expressing freedom of sexuality and kinks. So what we ended up doing to solve this issue is to expand the game to include 5 different backstories, and which explores different relationship models and fun situations, such as like caretaker walking into a party at an elderly home, or a teenager trying to explain to their grandparents what a dildo is. And we felt like this change really liberated us from the moral ambiguity of cheating, as well as like this monogamous, like standard monogamous relationship model. And it really allows us to embrace this topic of sex fully and let the players focus on telling the best story and give the best performance. Yeah. And next slide. And I also want to echo with what Clio said earlier about the tone. Like, it was really, like, we really struggled with the ending part of the game because the entire game was like, people laughed so hard about all the stories, but at the end all became this like apologetic and like serious ending. So it was like, it was hard. I wish that someday like someone can come up with a sex game that can have both tones. That would be interesting because it is a really challenging design question for me. Yeah, and then in terms of the design of the cards, we had gender neutral names and pronouns for all our characters, and we also specified in the rules that the pronouns are up to the players themselves. And for the cards, we included a wide range of different kinks, like sex toys, like magic wands and love egg, and also BDSM stuff like bed restraints, but also more sensual ones like hot wax candle and the tactile and auditory sensations like ASMR tape or octopus tentacle. I think at one point we had like inflated balloon or something like that because we discovered the balloon kink, and that was kind of interesting. Yeah, I think.
Amazing. That's such a great segue back to the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is to go back to honey and hot wax. Let's see. I think I've got it on the next slide. So yeah, one of the games in this collection is actually about balloon kink. But these are the three games that are made by our three panelists here, Jonaya, Clio, and Sharang. And we just have just enough time for me to ask you guys each. I would love to know, like, what's one thing that you feel like is important about sex, intimacy, erotic games that you express through the design of your game? And I want to toss it to Clio first.
Yeah, so I think like my whole thing is that at the end of the day, almost every game that is like heavily about sex is actually a game that's also just kind of about communication and communicating correctly and kindly and making sure that everybody is on the same page. And like Pass the Sugar Please, that was kind of my attempt at that because it's about like what happens when you can't communicate.
Oh my god, I'm
honestly.
so right there with you. That's what Consentacle is about too. Sharang, what how about you? Sharang, you're muted.
Yeah. So my game is about is mainly about identity and sexual practice, and does performing certain sex acts change your identity, right? So in this game, you have two straight bros, and the game asks you, obviously it asks you, you don't have to because you're the player, but the game asks you to actually perform sex act on the other player. So you perform, I think you perform manual stimulation on them, and then you perform oral sex on them, and then you make out at the end. And then you stare into each other's eyes for 3 minutes as the last thing. And the game asks you to consider this idea of, if you are having sex with another person, does that actually change your identity? Are you gay if you are a straight man and have had sex with another man? Are you now gay or are you not? Right? The game asks you to consider that. It also asks you to consider, what does voicing or not voicing that mean? Does it, if you hooked up with a dude and then never talk about it, what does that mean to your relationship? Is it forgotten? Is it unspoken? Does it mean you're hetero flexible? I think that's one of the core explorations.
Awesome. And finally, Jonaya, tell us one thing about Feeding Lucy.
Actually,
You're
okay, there we go. I go along with what Clio has said, actually. Feeding Lucy is a game about communication, and it's about communication with your partner, who may or may not be Dracula. But it's also about communication with yourself. mutual masturbation and masturbation in and of itself is a great way to learn what your body needs and what your body is seeking during pleasure. And there is power in masturbation and power in understanding what your own needs and wants are. And I tried to explore it through the age-old tale of like destroying sort of this hetero-patriarchal notion of who should be chained up, right? And whose desires should be chained. So I really wanted everyone to understand their bodies and to understand that they deserve to feel good.
All right, thank you guys so much. We're just about out of time, but oh my God, there's so many more exciting topics we could go into, right? We could talk about consent in games. We could talk about how do you playtest this stuff. We've just touched on all this fun stuff about communication. So out there, those of you who are watching this, if you are brave enough to join us in this sometimes terrifying, sometimes ridiculous, often blush-inducing territory, there's a lot of play to explore of many different kinds and with many different tones. Check out Honey and Hot Wax. It's a great introduction to role-playing games in this area, and check out Nothing to See Here. I think that they're launching a Kickstarter soon for like a different kind of card-driven role-playing. And with that, yeah, I want to go to our final slide where you can, get all of our contact information. This is all of us. So if you want to, tune in to the things that we're doing, this is where you can find us on Twitter. Thanks so much, everybody. Yay!
Woot!
Thank you, Naomi.
Yeah, thank you for moderating us, Naomi.
Yeah, my pleasure. Play sex games.
I'm super. I know my job is supposed to, come here and like summarize everything, but there was just so much covered that this panel could have just gone on for like another 2 hours, and I would have just been like this, just keep going, because there are just so many things that were touched on that I think are just super vital, and there's no way I can cover it all, but things that really jumped out to me. In the beginning, there was talk about how we need to have people of different body types, different socioeconomic backgrounds, orientation, sexual orientation, just everyone needs to be represented, because I think there's something super important about seeing another being that looks like you enjoying something. And I think that just having that, even if it's a form of entertainment, and honestly, this goes beyond entertainment. There's entertainment, but this is really like therapy. You're talking about like all of these live action role-playing games, and you're talking about having to, voice your actual feedback, not just what's going on in your head, but having to say things like, oh yeah, I'm actually breathing, faster. Like these things are, I think, pushing people out of their comfort zones, which is something that is amazing when you're trying to grow and develop as a person. So thank you all on this panel for your work. It's ridiculously awesome. I will personally make it my goal to follow all of you and support you, because I'm a big fan. Everyone who's watching this, you need to comment, share, like this, show your support, and just make sure that you have fun. Just allow yourself to enjoy everything that you've just learned, take it in, and pay it forward. Just make sure that everyone knows that this is an important part of life, and it can be enjoyed via gaming, whether it's digital or analog. So thank you to our panel. You've been amazing. We're going to keep it going. So stay right where you are, keep it locked in.